Hey everybody, welcome back to Drew the Catholic, and not the usual setup. We're actually at the Catholic Answers Conference in San Diego, and we have Joe Heschmeyer on. Joe, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, thanks for having us, really. I mean, you guys put this conference together. It's a well-oiled machine. I mean, it's very smooth. It's a fun thing to attend, and it seems like you guys really have a good event here.
Thanks. It's, you know what, I can't take a ton of credit for it. There's a bunch of people who do very hard work behind the scenes, and there's people like me who just fly in, give some talks, eat good food, talk to good people.
That's the fun part.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it's like being an uncle, you know, where you're just like, I don't have to do any of the hard work. I'm just going to come in and have fun, play with the kids, and then leave.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's how we felt too. I mean, they invited all these creators out, and we've all been hanging out with you guys in the green room, and it's fun because you see people online, they have their content persona, but everyone's just normal people, right? And so you're having those conversations in the green room, sharing a sandwich, and it's a good time. So I've been enjoying it.
I mean, I think there's always like the fear, like, what if somebody's like a huge jerk behind the scenes? They just they seem really nice, and I don't think. I mean, maybe I just don't know, but I think I work with some amazing people, and it's been a real blessing.
Yeah, it's a cool team. It's been good to interact with all your staff and stuff too. It's been fun.
Great.
Yeah. Well, so something I've been thinking about a lot, and this is what I was thinking about in talking to you, just based on your work in the Fathers and some of your videos about culture that you've done recently, and some of the ones you've done about Protestantism specifically. It seems that by and large, culture has moved away from, sort of the atmosphere of what you might call Christendom, or even just, Judeo-Christian values. And that's shifted slowly for a long time, and now it's happening quite rapidly. And I think Catholics have kind of been, we're kind of taken aback by that. We're like, whoa, what happened, right?
Right.
So I wanted to just talk about what is the atmosphere of the culture we're in now.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, well, it's a weird one too, as American Catholics specifically, because I think Europe has its own story of like slowly losing the faith and like the whole impact of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and so on. But in America, Catholics were like fighting to be accepted in this very deeply, strongly Protestant culture that was very religious, but often very anti-Catholic. And so it's like we're knocking at the door, trying to prove, look, we are fellow Christians. We worship the same God you do. We think you're wrong in some ways. You think we're wrong in some ways. But surely you can accept us as fellow Americans and as fellow believers. And it seemed like no sooner had that happened than suddenly the culture in which we were trying so hard to integrate was like, oh, and by the way, we don't believe in God anymore. And so it was this kind of head-spinning move. And many Catholics who'd been fighting so hard to be taken seriously as Americans, I think got swept up in that. And in many cases followed the culture rather than the church and kind of went in that direction of being indifferent to, hostile to, an open rebellion from God in various ways. And so it is a very strange thing where the posture I think we had as Catholics for a couple of 100 years in the U.S., and what we understood was kind of going on, it's very different. Like, it's hard to believe the same place that was once home to the Puritans and the Great Awakening, that it now is so deeply and thoroughly secular and anti-Christian in many ways, in many contexts. I mean, and I don't want to suggest like, oh, we're uniquely persecuted as Christians. I just mean it is a rapid loss of faith, as you say. Something had begun slowly and then went very quickly. It is in the lifetime of older members of your viewing audience where they can remember times where seemingly almost everybody went to church. And that is very much not the case now. And even in my own lifetime, I'm almost 40, it went from, even if people weren't practicing a general cultural consensus around Christianity in some vague sense, to, I would say we don't even have that. It is not even something that's particularly remarkable. For instance, if like a major political candidate is not a Christian. That used to be shocking, eyebrow raising, maybe like exciting and progressive, maybe like disqualifying, but it was at least worth talking about. It's not even that anymore for many people. And that points to a cultural atrophying that is remarkable.
Right. Well, something I've talked about with my priest a lot is, back in the day when we did have that atmosphere of Christendom and it was almost assumed, catechetics almost took care of itself, right? Because people in the parishes had this understanding that was almost just caught by being in the culture that we had. And so then you add a couple things to make them well-formed Catholics. And we've had the long fallout of that I think we've seen. And now that we don't have that atmosphere, maybe at all to any large degree, what do you think that changes for us as Catholics in terms of our posture to evangelize people and to catechize the people that are already in our pews?
We need to be much more worried than we have been. I mean, you can talk to older priests. I've heard priests talk about how in the old days, people would leave the faith or they'd rebel when they were in college. They'd stop going to church, but then they'd get married at 25 or 22, and then they'd come back and they'd start getting serious about their faith, and they'd get their kids baptized, and they'd get back with the program. Well, several things are happening now. Number one, people are waiting longer and longer to get married and have kids, if at all. Number two, when they're having kids, statistically, they're way less likely to get them baptized. So they're leaving and they're not coming back. And so you can't just be like, oh yeah, we've seen it, we know what's going to happen. They're going to leave and come back. No, they're not. They're not. And so you have to be much more proactive. You have to fight way harder, and in many cases much earlier, to make sure that you're building a solid Christian foundation. And you cannot just take for granted that the culture is on your side, because it's not. You can't take for granted that the parents, who are such a critical partner in this, are on your side, because even if they want to be, many of them are now at a point where they're not well enough formed to be able to pass the faith in any meaningful Orthodox sense on to their own children. And so it creates all sorts of unique problems to know, well, where do we even begin to kind of tackle that problem? Right. And so I don't say that to be super depressing, but just to recognize, like, we've got evangelical work cut out for us. I'll give you one quick example, if you don't mind. I was speaking to a young woman who was a college student, and she, like, we just kind of started a conversation. It doesn't really matter, the backstory behind it. And she mentioned that both of her grandfathers had been Protestant pastors. She was not a Christian, but more strikingly, she knew nothing. She knew nothing about Christianity. I have talked to people who had no association with Christianity, who seemed better versed. She wasn't hostile. It was just as if you wanted to talk to me about, like, Brazilian martial arts. I'd be like, I'm mildly interested. I have no idea. And so she was interested. But there was a particular moment in the conversation where she goes, wait, you guys think the Holy Spirit is God too? And I was like, how are we at a place where an American who's never left Kansas, does not even know about the Trinity, and both of her grandfathers were pastors? Like, that, for me, embodied kind of the nature of what had happened in a very short time. You went from obviously believing Christians to non-practicing to wildly ignorant in the span of 2 generations. And she wasn't hostile. I mean, she actually became Catholic in a very short time. She heard the gospel. She loved it. But it was very telling that it showed kind of where we were starting from.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder what that changes in terms of the landscape of, like, the work that you're doing or the creators are doing. Because for a long time, so I'm a Protestant convert, and for me, there was a ton of available work, like the stuff Catholic Answers does. It's like, hey, here's Protestant objections, and here's where those are, not holding up historically or whatever. So to bridge the gap from, like, merely Christian or culturally Christian to practicing Catholic was maybe a little easier, but now we're starting from zero. So what does that change for you and for Catholic creators?
I think it means Trent Horn is the best of us. And what I mean by that is, for a long time, I think you see it reflected even in our work at Catholic Answers. A lot of us came of an age where most of the objections we were hearing were objections from on-fire Protestants who were out to get Catholic. Like Carl Keating famously starts Catholic Answers after some fundamentalists had been leafleting cars in his church parking lot with anti-Catholic drivel. And it was false, and he wanted to answer it, so he wrote Catholic Answers and signed it as Catholic Answers and realized he needed a P.O. box, and somehow that turned into Catholic.com. So we were kind of off to the races. Well, nowadays, you've got fewer and fewer people coming from that background. They still exist, and I'm happy that there are people like the people who work here, and hopefully myself as well, who can answer those objections. But those are by no means the only or most serious kind of arguments out there. You have a lot of people who are hostile to any belief in God. You have people who may have a vague belief in God, but may be hostile to Christianity itself. And so we just have to be prepared for much more kind of existential level challenges. So to that end, I would encourage more like if people listening here are interested in becoming content creators, I think there's a temptation to want to do the deep end kind of stuff. To say, hey, here's this extremely niche academic argument, and here's the response to it.
Right.
And there's a place for that for like 5 people. But what a lot of people need to hear is just a really basic proclamation of the kerygma, of the gospel. That they need the gospel presented in simple terms, assuming they know nothing. And people are going to look down their nose at you because they're going to say, oh, you're teaching first grade. But people need, like, if you lived in a world in which there were no first grade teachers, my dad was a 4th grade teacher, and he had a college degree, obviously. He'd studied a trimester at Oxford, but he always would claim that all he needed was 5th grade. And I don't think that's true, but there's this idea that someone really does need to do the 101 work.
Right.
And not just do the really cool, fascinating, deep end sort of stuff. And I think Trent Horn was one of the first people in the Catholic space to really sense where the culture was going and start to spend a lot of time answering atheism, answering pro-choice arguments, and the rest, because those are things that are really major.
Yeah, it's with his rebrand too. Kyle Whittington and I were just talking. He looks like the Catholic Ben Shapiro, like, even with his logo and like the really hard photos of him just kind of like staring at the camera. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think another thing I think about a lot too is, especially as, this is the way that we communicate, is podcasts and videos and YouTube shorts and things like that. There's every method of communication can and should be used virtuously for the propagation of the gospel and bring people into the church. But we need to do it in a way too that doesn't succumb to the ways of the world. And obviously the algorithm has some issues and some temptations for people who are maybe creating content, whether, like at the level you are, at the level I am, or maybe just starting out. So that whole scale to be embodied. How do we approach that to where we can still be effective and still reach people, but without, maybe succumbing to some of the darker sides of that process?
What I would suggest is reading Neil Postman's book from maybe 1985 called Amusing Ourselves to Death. Because Postman is kind of in the same climate as someone like the communications scholar Marshall McLuhan, the guy who says the medium is the message. And he's very attuned to the fact that different media do different things to us and do different things to the message that we share. So if you imagine like the next papal encyclical was a TikTok video, that tells you something, like that trivializes things in a certain way by virtue of the medium, regardless of the content. And so one of the things we have to figure out how to handle is, well, how do we present the gospel in these ways when the medium itself is often inherently degrading? I would suggest there's a sense in which a short like TikTok, it can be inherently degrading to the human person because it is only focused on entertainment and it does not work very well for substance. Nevertheless, people have done really great work in those spaces. So it is this push-pull of what are the limits of this medium and what can I effectively accomplish?
That's good. Last thing I'll ask, and then I'll have you plug what you're up to. But for the average Catholic who's, I'm not going to be a content creator. I have a day job, but I just want to see people in my parish. How do they posture themselves in this new apostolic age, if you want to call it, maybe this post-Christian world that we're kind of living in? What does that change for how they talk to their friends and neighbors and how they present the gospel where they live in?
Yeah, I think number one, being openly Christian. That doesn't mean like being obnoxious about it, but letting people know you're Christian can be a very good first step. If you have something like a good Christian community, one of the major things the modern age is missing isn't just faith, it's community. And if you are, like, let's say you've got a group of friends and you can invite a non-Catholic, non-Christian person into that group of friends, the likelihood that they become Catholic after that, statistically, it's pretty decent. And it doesn't even take any you don't have to read some deep book. You just have to be authentic, live your faith, and let this be the attractive, inviting message that it inherently is. That kind of thing changes hearts and minds. I know this anecdotally. I can point to plenty of cases where that's happened, but it's also there in the data. Somebody like Rodney Stark, the sociologists who've done work on how religion spread, a lot of it is just through having those good networks. So I would say take very seriously the problem of how you raise your kids, if you're of the age to do that, and take very seriously, like, are your friends being drawn closer to the church because of your friendship with them? And if not, what could you be doing differently in that way? It might be having more arguments. It might just be becoming more of a saint.
That's perfect. Well, awesome. I think that's about all the time we have. So just the last thing, where can people find what what are you up to next on your channel, books you're writing, things
okay.
like that?
So Shameless Potpourri is a podcast. It comes out every Tuesday and Thursday. You can get an audio version at shamelessjoe.com. Actually, that might be the Patreon, shamelessjoe.com. You just look up Shameless Potpourri on YouTube. People know how to use YouTube. I'm talking to a younger audience here. And then Catholic Answers, you can find all of the work of my fine colleagues at Catholic.com. So yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for coming on, Joe. And thanks everyone for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share, and then go over to Shameless Potpourri, which I'm sure you're already watching. So we'll see you all next time.
Thanks.